Good afternoon to you if you're just joining us here at LBC. Good to be back with you. I'm going to focus the first couple of hours probably of the programme on what we now know is to be announced at 3:30 in the Commons, that a report into sexual abuse carried out by grooming gangs and England and Wales, due to be released today. That report, it has concluded that a public inquiry is necessary, and Number 10 has confirmed that will take place. Baroness Casey, Dame Louise Casey's audit will look into the demographics of the grooming gangs and their victims, including ethnicity. Downing Street has said that a new national inquiry announced by Keir Starmer over the weekend will hold institutions who fail to protect young people to account. Now, we spoke just a week ago or so, just before I went on holiday, didn't we, about the difficulties of holding institutions to account rather than individuals to account. And Maggie Oliver, a former Greater Manchester police officer who's been a guest on this programme many times as we've discussed these dreadful stories of child sexual abuse in the sort of model of grooming, has talked about it being, I think she just nailed what it is that's happened. Gross criminal neglect at the top of policing, gross criminal neglect at the top of government, and gross criminal neglect at the top of social services. Now, they're all institutions of one form or another, but to just find the institution wanting, given the seriousness of these crimes and the shattering of people's lives that they've involved, might feel to some of the victims like they're being shortchanged. We'll hear in just a moment from David Greenwood, head of the Child Abuse Compensation Department at Switulski's solicitors. We've spoken to David a number of times as well. But I'm joined first by Anna Hall, a BAFTA award-winning director of a programme many of you may have watched already, Groomed, a National Scandal, looking in detail at some of the experiences of some of the victims and the responses that came from some of those organisations that Maggie Oliver describes. Anna, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
There's a lot to look at, as you know well from your documentary. In it, just in case people aren't familiar with it, in it you very much let the survivors of this and the victims of this very clearly speak about what had happened to them, and most importantly, in a way, what the response was when they did look for help.
Yes. So this film was actually my fourth film on the subject for Channel 4, and I started in the early 2000s. I made a film called Edge of the City, and this was my sort of 20th year anniversary, if you like. And what I felt over the years, Sheelagh, I can talk about the other films that I made, but you know, the reality was that
Feel free to do so if you want to.
Thank you. I mean, what I really felt was, especially after all the Elon Musk stuff in January, and by then we were well into the edit and well into the production, but it felt that who was hearing from the survivors directly? And as I was setting up that film, I'd followed police investigations, I'd been to talk to the Pakistani community myself, I'd followed social service investigations, and actually what I felt was the voice of the survivors was being pushed from A to B to C to D and being pushed around like a political football. And so what we tried to do was to see if we could chart that 20-year history through the voices of survivors. And, you know, I wanted to try and find survivors that would be happy to go on camera. And, you know, obviously you can imagine that was a very long and, you know, detailed job, because we had to be so careful about whether it was right for them. Yeah. So we found 5 women, 2 of whom were happy to break their anonymity, Jade and Chantal, who many of your listeners may have seen. They were on Good Morning Britain this morning. They were on Newsnight a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. And actually, you know, but they first told their story to my production team and to me. And, you know, they were supported through Maggie's foundation. And, you know, the reality is that we try to track down people whose stories started in the early 2000s. So we had 3 women whose stories started in the early 2000s. They were 11, they were 12, you know, and what happened to them was, you know, a pattern that has become remarkably familiar to all of us, but they were in children's homes, and they were they were approached by young men who made them feel special, who flattered them, who, they were young teenagers who didn't have a family to support them. And, I think it's really, interesting. Every young teenager in the country wants affirmation and wants to be valued.
We all need to be, even as adults, we all need to be witnessed, don't we, and seen. And if you don't have a family around you that's doing that witnessing and that seeing, you'll take crumbs, won't you, probably?
Exactly. And so, and so that process is that they get ensnarled in the most horrific cycle of sexual abuse, and they didn't know the term grooming, and they were called prostitutes, they were called, we were putting ourselves at risk,
addicts.
All of that we saw in the film, that as they very painstakingly told their stories, that they were accused of putting themselves at risk. And the thing that I find utterly flabbergasting is that they were children.
11.
Chantal was 11 years old. She was in a children's home in Manchester. She was crying out for help, and she describes that so perfectly and beautifully in the film that she said, I tried again and again to try and get help.
And Erin, who is one of the stories that you told as well, groomed from the age of 12, first raped at 13. The police told, so her mother did intervene and try to get help. The police told her mother Erin had made a lifestyle choice. Good God, she's 12.
Yeah.
But she had bite marks from head to toe.
Yeah.
Her mother ended up in desperation taking her child's knickers to the police and saying, "Look, this is not. I'm not approving of this. This is not normal."
Yeah.
A lot has been made, and I wonder what you think of this. A lot has been made of, and it's going to be part of the inquiry, the ethnicity of both the victims and the perpetrators. And it's certainly, when we've talked about this over the years on the phone in programmes that I present, a lot of that comes through. A lot of the anger and the antipathy that comes through is towards Pakistani men, the Pakistani community. And that's clearly an element that has to be looked at. But how much of this do you think is about misogyny and classism, if that's a word? I mean, we know it's a thing, but is it a word?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been trying to grapple with this for 20 years. And, my perception is that what happened in the early 2000s is that, authorities didn't act, social services didn't act. People like Erin and Chantal were crying out for help. And the police were very, very slow to act. Again, we've got another case of a girl called Steph in the film. She wanted to give her evidence to the police. And what I think happened, Sheelagh, is that there was a void and a vacuum, and that, the far right walked straight into that. And I think that, I went to talk by the time I've been, working on this for 7 or 8 years, I went to talk to the British Pakistani community, because I thought no one's talking to them, and what do they think? And again in the film you see me we talked to a group of mothers in Sheffield in 2010, and they're utterly horrified, and they say, if this was my daughter, I would want these men locking up. And I went to talk to a group of men in Keighley who say, we are proud British Muslim men. This is absolutely horrific.
Well, in the same way, forgive me, in the same way, when I have conversations with people about this on air, I point to the fact that some of these grooming gangs, and I'm not saying you don't investigate the ethnicity, but some of these grooming gangs, say in Bristol, for example, were largely white, in Oxford, largely white. And we don't assume that all white mothers and fathers don't give a stuff about their kids.
Exactly.
Random parents you could meet there would be saying the same to you,
Exactly. And that's what I want to say, because I feel there's a great disservice that's been done to the British Pakistani community as a whole, because they want people to be investigated. They think these men are criminals. And so therefore we shouldn't be shying away from it because of the ethnicity. We should be saying child abuse is child abuse. These kids were 11, 12, 13, 14. They were violently raped. And, we shouldn't be, and I really feel that strongly, that there's a disservice to the lovely, wider, hard-working British Pakistani community who want the police to arrest them, and they want them to be charged.
And just a final thought from you, Anna, before I speak to David. From this inquiry, it seems that my central question is, everything I read about it today and yesterday over the weekend, an awful lot of it I already know. You clearly already know. What does it need to find out? What does it need to establish? It will clearly be worthwhile for the victims, but is it worthwhile for the country, I suppose, would be my question.
Well, my quick answer to both that question is that I feel very, very strongly that we need to hold this government to carry on the recommendations of Baroness J. So, as you know, there were 20 recommendations from the Independent Inquiry of Child Sexual Abuse. You know, Jess Phillips announced the Child Protection Agency in April. Yvette Cooper announced mandatory reporting. That's going through the Commons at the moment. So we have to keep holding the government to account to make sure that they are implementing those vital recommendations. We can't wait 3 years for that. But what I do think is interesting about this inquiry is it's a statutory inquiry, which means that for the first time, people have to be compelled, to give evidence. And that is different, Sheelagh. And I think that's really important for people to know, which is, you know, so the people that set up Operation Augusta in Manchester in 2004 and then closed it down immediately because there were lack of resources, you know, 97 perpetrators were left on the streets. Let's call them to this inquiry. Yeah. But I don't want it to take 3 years. The survivors cannot wait for 3 years for the government to implement it.
Thank you very much, Anna. Very good to talk to you. Anna Hall, BAFTA award-winning director of Groomed, a national scandal. If you haven't seen it already, I'd urge you to take a look at it. David Greenwood is with me, was listening to all or most of that, head of the Child Abuse Compensation Department at Switalski's Solicitors. David, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Sheelagh.
I know that one of your concerns is that the J recommendations of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse nationally, it does not get lost in all of this.
Exactly. That's really the point that I want to make. We need to... it's obviously a great thing that the government is looking into a strand of child sexual abuse, but child sexual exploitation in this model only makes up for 7% of all child sexual abuse that takes place in the country. So we mustn't lose sight of the 93% of children who are being abused, possibly right now, and who have been abused in the past. And we need to make sure that that kind of harm is being looked at. The National Inquiry led by Professor J made these 20 recommendations, which Anna has just mentioned, and only 3 of those recommendations so far the government have committed to. We want to see all of them brought into existence.
And do you believe that this inquiry, this particular inquiry, is vital? What do you think it must reveal or achieve in order to be seen as successful?
Personally, I don't think it's vital. We essentially already know what's happened. The public possibly... it's quite bewildering to me that the public don't know all these facts already. We've already been through Rotherham, we've been through Rochdale.
Well, the thing is, they do. They've been made to think that they don't, I think, by Elon Musk and by others. But I certainly, I mean, I don't know all of the facts of every individual case, but my sense of it was that we knew that these girls had been ignored. We knew that the investigations had been inadequate. We knew that they didn't get real justice, many of them. We knew that some of their perpetrators were coming back to live in the communities that they had lived in before, in which they carried out the abuse. We knew these horrors. So this inquiry presumably has to be about accountability, real accountability, possibly even criminal accountability.
Well, it's funny you should mention accountability because, how will a national inquiry look into accountability? It would take forever to go through accountability to work out who did what and when, or who didn't do what and when, and name names. If it's going to have any effect at all, it can only be done in conjunction with detailed local inquiries, which can work out what happened on the ground, and feed that back into a central inquiry or database to inform the public of exactly what has happened. If we want to do that, that's fine. Yeah. I don't really see there's a need to spend years and lots of public money doing it, but I really am in favour of these local inquiries. Then names can be named and we can work out what's happened in the past.
And you're not concerned that because they're local, they're soft?
Absolutely not, no. If you get the right person of an independent nature with a team who is enabled to get into the documentation and speak to staff. The experience of Rotherham was that staff in councils and police actually want to speak to these investigators and want to say, look, this happened or this didn't happen. I've got every faith that local inquiries can work and get to the bottom of exactly what didn't happen.
Do you think it will serve, because clearly you want the victims to be served, and had this happened to me or my daughter, I would want to see the head of council services or the head of children's services or the head of the police at the time or the head of safeguarding in the police at the time. I would want to see them explaining why they did their job so badly and didn't save my child or save me. I would want to see that. That would come some way to satisfying me. But that's thinking as a victim. Do you think this inquiry serves the country?
Oh, gosh. I'd like to say that it does, but I really don't think it's going to take us. I mean, I know a lot about this field.
So you represented some of the victims.
Yeah, not a lot you can tell me about what's happened here. I suppose there's some of the country that want to know about it. I fear that some of this is just feeding into this right-wing agenda and promoting, stoking racism. I do worry about that. I want that to be avoided.
Do you think it has less to do with racism and more to do with dismissing working class girls, poor girls, girls in care, girls that we can dismiss as slags if they get raped?
Yeah, there's certainly an element of that, but it didn't just happen to girls in care.
No, true.
My experience is that it happened to girls who were living at home as well. I don't think it's a phenomenon that's centred around class. I think it's how children are treated at home in their early teens, whether they feel loved or alienated at home. They're seeking attention, and these people prey on them and try to control them.
And then they get a kind of malign attention, don't they, rather than a benign attention. David, thank you. There's an awful lot to dig into here, isn't there, in terms of our conversation. David Greenwood, head of the Child Abuse Compensation Department at Switowski's Solicitors. My sense of it, for what it's worth, and I'm very keen to hear from you as well, is if the survivors, the victims of these men, say more needs to be heard, more needs to be seen, more needs to be done, then who am I to argue with that? However, a great deal, as David was saying and as Anna was saying, a great deal of this is already known. This is why I'm keen to get to what is it this public inquiry is going to reveal to me that I don't already know.